In the early spring of 1242, the ice over Lake Peipus had not yet surrendered to the thaw. It lay stretched and silent between forests and low horizons, a pale, wind-scoured expanse dividing worlds. To the west, Latin Christendom pressed forward with the authority of Rome and the weight of armored cavalry. To the east, the fractured lands of Rus struggled to survive between crusade and conquest. The ice would soon become more than a boundary. It would become a weapon. Europe in the mid-13th century was unsettled ground. The old certainties of empire and faith were shifting. The Mongol invasions had ripped across the Eurasian steppe like a storm without end. In 1237 and 1238, mounted armies under Batakhan reduced entire principalities of northeastern Rus to ash. Cities that had stood for generations, Vladimir, Ryazan, were left charred and broken. The once powerful Kievan order was fractured beyond recognition. To the north, however, one city endured. Novgorod had always been different. A mercantile republic tied more to Baltic trade than steppe politics. It faced west as much as east. Its wealth came from fur, timber, and access to northern rivers. Its survival depended not on walls alone, but on calculated diplomacy and careful alliances. When Mongol forces reached its sphere, Novgorod avoided annihilation through negotiation and distance. But survival had come at a price. Tribute and submission to the rising power of the Mongol Empire. This delicate balancing act left the northwest exposed. While Rus reeled from the eastern catastrophe, Latin crusading orders saw opportunity. The Baltic frontier had long been a zone of holy war. Pagan tribes had been subdued over decades by military monastic orders, most prominently the Teutonic Order and its northern branch, the Livonian Order. Their mission blended faith and expansion. Conversion was pursued with sword and charter alike. The collapse of Central Rus authority created a vacuum. From their fortified bases along the Baltic coast, Germanic knights and Danish allies began pushing inland. Fortresses were seized. Trade routes were threatened. In 1240, Swedish forces attempted to strike along the Neva River, probing Novgorod's northern defenses. That attack was repelled by a young prince, Alexander Nevsky, whose name would soon become inseparable from the ice itself. But victory brought little stability. Within Novgorod's political system, princes ruled only with the consent of powerful boyar families. Alexander's assertive leadership unsettled factions wary of centralized authority. He was dismissed, exiled at a moment when the Western threat was consolidating. The Livonian Order did not hesitate. In 1241, they captured the city of Pskov, a key defensive stronghold guarding access to Novgorod's southern approaches. German knights installed garrisons and began fortifying their hold. Local elites were replaced or coerced. For the first time, Latin military power had established a durable foothold deep within Rus territory. The political calculation was clear. If Novgorod could be isolated, its trade severed, its satellite towns subdued, the Republic would either submit or fall. Appeals were made to Rome. Earlier papal calls for crusade against the eastern schismatics still echoed under the authority of Pope Gregory IX. Campaigns in the Baltic were framed not merely as expansion, but as spiritual correction. The Orthodox East, weakened and fragmented, was seen as ripe for alignment or domination. Novgorod internal divisions dissolved under pressure. The boyars who had expelled Alexander now faced a harder truth. Without unified military leadership, they would be dismantled piecemeal. The prince was recalled in 1241. His return was not ceremonial. It was urgent. Alexander did not move recklessly. His position was precarious. To the east stood the Mongol Empire, whose power he could not openly defy. To the west, armored crusaders advanced with institutional backing and hardened experience. Any campaign had to be swift, decisive, and limited. He could not afford prolonged war on two fronts. First, he struck at Pskov. Winter favored mobility across frozen rivers and marshes. Alexander's forces advanced, retaking the city and expelling the Livonian garrison. Prisoners were captured. Local collaborators were punished. The message was unmistakable. Novgorod would not concede its periphery without resistance. But reclaiming Pskov did not end the conflict. It escalated it. The Livonian Order began assembling a larger force for decisive engagement. Reinforcements were drawn from German knightly families. Danish vassals in Estonia, and local auxiliaries. Their military culture emphasized shock action, heavy cavalry charges designed to shatter infantry formations against fragmented Rus militias. This approach had proven effective in prior encounters. Alexander understood this pattern. His own forces were not homogeneous. They included Novgorodian militia infantry, professional retainers known as druzina, and contingents from allied principalities. They were accustomed to forest warfare and defensive engagements, not open-field confrontation against armored knights. If he allowed the enemy to choose terrain freely, the advantage would tilt westward. So he made a calculated decision. Rather than defend within city walls, he would draw the enemy outward, away from fortified support, on the ground of his choosing. Geography offered a solution. Lake Peipus formed a broad natural barrier between Livonian-controlled territories and Novgorod sphere. In early April, its ice remained thick but unstable in places where currents moved beneath the surface. The lake's openness could invite a cavalry assault, yet conceal subtle weaknesses in footing. It was neither solid earth nor open water. It was transitional, unpredictable. For Alexander, unpredictability was an asset. The Western Knights believed in momentum. Their doctrine favored concentrated charge, disciplined formation, and the psychological impact of armored advance. On firm terrain, that charge could rupture almost any line. But if the ground betrayed them, even slightly, their cohesion could fracture. Alexander's task then was to impose doubt. He needed to appear vulnerable enough to invite attack, yet resilient enough to endure initial impact. His formation would have to absorb the shock and hold long enough for countermaneuver. Meanwhile, political stakes extended beyond the battlefield. Should Novgorod fall, the entire northwest of Rus might drift into the Latin sphere. Trade with the Hanseatic cities would be reshaped under German control. Orthodox ecclesiastical structures would face external pressure. The frontier between Rome and the Eastern Rite would shift permanently. And to the east, Mongol observers watched. Alexander could not appear rebellious or unstable in the eyes of the Khan's envoys. His authority to rule depended on recognition from the Golden Horde's administration. A catastrophic defeat against the Livonian Order would weaken his standing not only at home, but within the Mongol political hierarchy. Thus, as winter lingered into spring, two forces moved cautiously toward convergence. The Livonian host advanced eastward, confident in discipline and divine sanction. Their banners bore crosses signifying crusade. Their commanders anticipated another decisive mounted engagement that would force Novgorod into submission. Alexander marched westward with quieter resolve. He did not seek annihilation. He sought deterrence, a demonstration that further encroachment would be costly, unpredictable, and ultimately futile. Between them stretched miles of ice. Wind swept low across the frozen surface, carrying fine crystals that obscured depth perception. The horizon blurred into pale gray. Beneath the surface, water currents shifted silently, thinning ice in irregular patches. What appeared uniform from a distance concealed subtle fractures. In this austere landscape, strategic calculation would intersect with environmental risk. Neither side yet understood how profoundly the setting would shape events. They moved toward the lake not merely as armies, but as embodiments of two expanding worlds, Latin and Orthodox, crusader and prince, cavalry doctrine and defensive adaptation. The ice waited, and in waiting, it offered neither side certainty. By early April 1242, both forces had moved into striking distance of one another along the frozen approaches to Lake Peipus. The season was deceptive. Winter had not entirely released its grip, yet the hard certainty of deep frost was fading. The surface of the lake appeared solid from a distance, wind-polished and pale beneath a low northern sky. But spring currents stirred beneath the ice, and near the southern reaches where the lake narrowed, subtle weaknesses formed, unseen to the eye, but waiting for weight. The Livonian host that advanced eastward was not a vast army by later medieval standards, yet it represented the concentrated military strength of the Baltic crusading frontier. At its core stood the armored knights of the Livonian Order, supported by brethren of the Teutonic Order and feudal contingents drawn from Danish Estonia. These were professional warriors shaped by decades of campaigning against Baltic tribes. Their battlefield doctrine emphasized cohesion, discipline, and the devastating shock of heavy cavalry. Each knight fought encased in mail hauberk and iron helmet, shield emblazoned with cross or heraldic device, mounted on a trained warhorse conditioned to charge into dense formations. Behind them marched infantry, sergeants, crossbowmen, and local auxiliaries, less heavily armored but steady enough to secure gains once the cavalry had broken resistance. Command within the Livonian ranks followed strict hierarchical lines. Military monks obeyed their masters without public dispute, their vows binding them to collective purpose. The expectation was straightforward. Identify the enemy's line, compress it with disciplined advance, and shatter it through concentrated force. This method had subdued Livs, Estonians, and other Baltic peoples who relied on looser tribal formations against scattered Rus militias in earlier encounters. Similar tactics had yielded success. The knights believed that firmness of formation and unity of purpose would once again decide the field. Across the ice, Prince Alexander Nevsky assembled a different kind of force. His strength lay not in uniformity, but in layered composition. The Druzina, his professional retainers, formed a disciplined corps, men accustomed to fighting beside their prince and maintaining order under pressure. Around them gathered the militia of Novgorod, armed with spears, axes, and bows. Additional contingents arrived from Vladimir Suzdal and neighboring principalities. Their equipment varied. Some wore lamellar armor influenced by steppe designs. Others fought with little more than padded protection. Their experience ranged from seasoned warriors hardened by Mongol incursions to townsmen summoned from trade and craft. Alexander understood these disparities. He could not rely on an overwhelming cavalry charge. His mounted force was smaller and less uniformly armored than that of the Crusaders. Nor could he risk open maneuver on terrain that favored the disciplined wedge formations of the knights. Instead, he sought to exploit elasticity, allowing the enemy to commit fully before revealing the resilience of his own line. He positioned his army on the southern portion of the lake, near the narrow strait later known as the Warm Lake, where underwater currents subtly weakened sections of ice. His center consisted largely of infantry, forming a visible line that suggested vulnerability. Archers were distributed to harass and disrupt. His cavalry, including Druzina elements, were placed on the flanks and slightly behind, concealed by distance and the flat horizon. The arrangement invited frontal assault, while preserving capacity for lateral movement. The morning of engagement dawned cold but bright, the sky washed pale by reflected ice. Wind swept across the lake's surface in long horizontal gusts, carrying grains of frost that reduced clarity at a distance. Both armies could see one another from afar, dark clusters against a white expanse. The openness removed any possibility of concealment. There would be no forest ambush, no hidden ravine, only formation against formation. The Livonian commanders assessed the Rus deployment and perceived opportunity. The infantry-heavy center appeared exposed. If broken swiftly, the remainder would likely scatter. Confidence reinforced their judgment. Years of successful campaigning had conditioned them to expect that disciplined cavalry would overwhelm irregular infantry. The order to advance was given. The knights formed a wedge, a tapered assault formation designed to concentrate force at a single penetrating point. Horses began at measured pace, hooves striking ice with hollow resonance. The sound carried across the lake, echoing strangely in the open air. As distance closed, the pace quickened. Shields angled forward, lances lowered. The wedge tightened. From the Rus line, archers released volleys. Arrows struck shields and armor, some glancing harmlessly away, others finding gaps. Yet momentum did not falter. The psychological impact of the advancing mass, steel and horseflesh accelerating across open ground, was immense. For militia infantry unaccustomed to receiving heavy cavalry, the instinct to break could be overwhelming. Alexander's center absorbed the first impact. The collision was violent. Lances shattered. Horses crashed into shield walls. The leading edge of the wedge drove deep, compressing the Rus formation. Men fell, trampled, or struck aside. The Crusaders pressed forward, seeking to widen the breach. For a moment, it appeared that the tactic would succeed exactly as intended. Yet the Rus line did not disintegrate. Infantry in the center yielded ground deliberately, bending rather than breaking. Their retreat was controlled, drawing the wedge deeper into the formation. Flanking units tightened inward, absorbing pressure along the sides of the penetrating knights. The battlefield, initially defined by a single forward thrust, began to compress around the attackers. The ice amplified every movement. Horses struggled for perfect footing as churned frost turned slick. The heavy armor that protected the knights also increased strain on mounts. While the ice did not shatter instantly beneath them, subtle cracking sounds echoed beneath concentrated weight. Stability required caution. Caution reduced momentum. As the wedge advanced further than anticipated, cohesion thinned. The leading knights found themselves increasingly isolated from supporting infantry, who lagged behind on the uneven surface. Communication across the expanding gap became difficult. The initial shock had succeeded, but exploitation required sustained coordination. Alexander recognized the moment. From his flanks, cavalry units moved inward in measured arcs. They did not charge recklessly, but advanced with controlled speed, targeting the exposed sides of the wedge. The maneuver transformed the geometry of the battlefield. What had begun as a forward thrust now faced lateral compression. The knights attempted to pivot, to reform lines and protect vulnerable flanks. But turning heavy horses on unstable ice demanded time and space. The wedge that had driven confidently into the rust center now found itself constricted, its tip embedded within infantry resistance while its sides absorbed pressure from mounted counterattack. Infantry fighting intensified at close quarters. Axes struck at bridles and legs. Spears thrust beneath shields. The clang of metal echoed across the frozen surface. Confusion replaced clarity. Individual knights, once part of a disciplined formation, fought in fragmented clusters. Beneath them, the ice groaned. It did not collapse in a single catastrophic rupture, as later legend would exaggerate. Instead, localized fractures appeared where weight and movement concentrated. Cracks spread outward in jagged lines. Water seeped upward through weakened sections, darkening patches beneath struggling men and horses. Animals stumbled. A fallen mount became an obstacle that disrupted order further. The psychological effect was immediate. For soldiers encased in heavy armor, the awareness of unstable footing introduced new fear. Combat already strained discipline. The possibility of drowning beneath ice compounded it. Momentum stalled. The wedge ceased to be an instrument of penetration and became instead a compressed mass struggling to maneuver. Alexander's forces pressed steadily. He did not order reckless pursuit, but sustained pressure. Archers targeted retreating elements. Cavalry harried disorganized groups attempting withdrawal. What had begun as an assertive crusader advance now transformed into a fight for extraction. The openness of the lake, initially perceived as advantage for cavalry, had become constraint. There was no cover, no terrain feature behind which to regroup. Every movement was visible, every retreat observable. Gradually, the Livonian formation lost coherence. Some knights attempted to fall back toward firmer western ice. Others fought stubbornly where they stood. Supporting infantry, unable to reinforce effectively, began to withdraw to avoid encirclement. The engagement did not end in sudden annihilation. It unfolded as erosion, discipline weakening under combined tactical pressure and environmental instability. By midday, the Crusader advance had fully stalled. By afternoon, it had reversed. Across the frozen expanse of Lake Peipus, the initiative had shifted. What remained uncertain was how far collapse would extend, and whether the psychological blow would prove as decisive as the physical losses suffered upon the ice. By mid-afternoon, the rhythm of battle on Lake Peipus had shifted decisively. What had begun as an assertive, disciplined advance by the Livonian Order now resembled a struggle for survival. The frozen expanse that had seemed a perfect stage for cavalry dominance had revealed its inherent fragility. Ice, unpredictable and subtly fractured, now amplified every misstep. Knights who had pressed forward with the confidence of years of campaign found their strength compromised, their weight no longer an advantage but a liability. Horses slipped, their legs sinking into hidden weaknesses beneath the surface. Men and mounts alike struggled to maintain balance, and the cohesion that had defined the wedge formations of the earlier assault began to unravel under pressure from flanking movements and persistent infantry resistance. Alexander Nevsky's strategy revealed its full purpose in these moments. By deliberately yielding the center of his formation, He had invited the enemy deeper onto the lake's unstable surface, effectively drawing the strongest units away from solid ground. His flanking cavalry, disciplined and coordinated despite varied equipment and training, moved inward, compressing the Livonian advance from both sides. Archers targeted isolated clusters, creating small zones of chaos, while infantry held the center steady. The battlefield had become a living trap, with the ice acting as both stage and weapon. The combination of psychological strain, loss of momentum, and environmental hazard undermined what seemed an unstoppable assault. The Livonian commanders faced decisions of critical consequence. They could attempt to withdraw in order, but the same ice that slowed their advance now hindered retreat. Horses became increasingly unmanageable as the lines attempted to realign. Communication broke down. Individual units acted independently, responding to immediate threats rather than coordinated orders. Panic began to seep into ranks that had been trained for obedience. The cohesion that had once been their greatest asset now worked against them, transforming potential strength into vulnerability. As men and mounts faltered, the risk of falling through the ice increased. The lake, once a silent expanse awaiting combat, now threatened to claim them outright, but it was not yet a massacre. The collapse was measured, tactical, and relentless, an erosion of structure rather than instant annihilation. Within this struggle, Alexander maintained control of his own forces with quiet discipline. His Druzina remained in reserve, poised to respond to openings. He refrained from overcommitting, understanding that the natural hazard of the ice was already performing part of the work. Militia units, previously considered unreliable, were reinforced in critical positions, their morale buoyed by the visible faltering of the enemy. Each advance, each press, was calculated to maximize pressure without overextending. The prince's understanding of both his men and the environment transformed potential vulnerability into an operational advantage, illustrating a nuanced grasp of combined arms that relied not solely on force, but on orchestration and timing. As the afternoon continued, localized collapses became more apparent. Groups of knights who had advanced too far found themselves partially encircled by Rus cavalry, their lines isolated from infantry support. Horses struggled over the thinning ice, some sinking into hidden pools, while riders fought to extricate themselves. These moments of physical danger reinforced psychological pressure, compounding confusion across the Livonian ranks. The very tactics that had once assured victory, the wedge formation, the concentrated forward push, now exposed participants to simultaneous environmental and tactical stress. In every fractured cluster, soldiers faced a compounded effect of physical danger, disruption of formation, and uncertainty about their comrades' actions. By early evening, the cumulative effect of these pressures became decisive. The Livonian advance had largely stalled, and elements of the army began to retreat in disorder. Alexander did not need to pursue recklessly. The natural limitations of terrain ensured that withdrawal was slow, constrained, and vulnerable. Isolated pockets of resistance continued to resist in fragmented form, but the psychological dominance had shifted. Confidence had been broken. What was once an invading force of disciplined, heavily armored knights was now a dispersed, struggling contingent navigating both the enemy and the treacherous ice beneath their feet. The aftermath of the engagement extended beyond immediate battlefield losses. Historical sources suggest that the Livonian order suffered substantial casualties. Men, horses, and equipment lost not only to combat, but to the very environment they had underestimated. The retreat across the lake was painstaking, with the remaining forces forced to regroup on the western shore. This event marked a significant psychological blow to the order, undermining the perception of invincibility that heavy cavalry had long projected across the Baltic frontier. For the Novgorodians, the victory reinforced both local confidence and strategic deterrence. It demonstrated that disciplined preparation, understanding of terrain, and psychological manipulation could counteract what appeared to be a superior military force. The battle's immediate political consequences were profound. The Livonian order, once capable of threatening Novgorod and exerting influence over neighboring territories, now faced a serious setback. Attempts to reassert control in the region were delayed by both material loss and the necessity of reorganization. Alexander Nevsky's position within Novgorod strengthened. His leadership was no longer merely one of military necessity, but of political legitimacy. Boyar factions that had questioned his authority were reminded of the consequences of disunity and the value of calculated, centralized command. The prince's ability to combine local forces, coordinate militia with professional retainers, and exploit environmental factors elevated his status as a commander of exceptional strategic foresight. Beyond the political and tactical implications, the Battle of Lake Peipus carried symbolic significance. In the wider context of medieval Europe, it illustrated the limits of conventional military doctrine when confronted with irregular tactics and natural hazards. Heavy cavalry, once seen as decisive on any battlefield, could be countered through preparation, terrain exploitation, and flexible coordination of disparate forces. The engagement became a reference point for later military thought in Rus, influencing defensive planning, the integration of militia, and the strategic use of geography to compensate for disparities in equipment or training. It also reinforced a notion that leadership required not only courage, but comprehension of context and understanding of both men and environment as factors in operational success. For individual soldiers, the experience was transformative. Novgorodian militiamen who survived the battle gained confidence in their capacity to confront a seemingly superior opponent. Livonian knights, conversely, were reminded of vulnerability and the consequences of over-reliance on traditional forms of shock. Horses, critical to medieval warfare, had suffered equally. Mounts lost to the ice reflected both material cost and disruption to future operations. The psychological weight of encountering a battlefield where environment itself became an adversary left an imprint that extended beyond immediate losses, influencing decision-making, caution, and approach in subsequent engagements.